On September 18th of 1978, Kiss, who was arguably the biggest band in the world at the time, did something that was questionable, strange, and kind of risky. They decided to release 4 solo albums, one for each member, all on the exact same day. And I've got all 4 of them right here. And since we recently lost Ace Frehley, I thought this would be a really interesting thing to talk about today, because his solo album kind of stands out for one particular reason, which we'll talk about here in a few minutes. But the different colors, one of the things they did is they used this artist to have this kind of a coordinated look between all 4 albums. And in my opinion, it's one of the coolest things to have these 4 portraits of these guys. So here's the one with Ace with kind of the blue. We have this one with Gene, which is red, the Paul with purple, and the Peter with green. And those color themes would go on into Dynasty and their costumes. You'd see those carried on. And if you go look at the album Asylum and you look at the colors of the lips, you'll see that they carried on these color themes with the Bruce Kulick has blue lips, Eric Carr has green lips, Paul has purple, and Gene has red. So they carried on those color themes well beyond these solo albums. Now, on October 26th of 1978, the Miami Herald, and you can see it on your screen right now, put out this really interesting review talking about these 4 solo albums. And this is what I wanted to share with you today, because I think you'll find what they had to say about this stuff pretty interesting. It's a little bit brutal in a couple places, but it also is pretty honest about what was going on at the time with these solo records. Now, the history of these solo records is questionable, because when you listen to different people talk about this, the stories are all told a little bit different. I mean, there's one that said when they were filming Kiss Meets the Phantom of the Park, that there were riffs in the band, and then that's when they came up with the idea to do the solo albums. And then other things you read, it turns out that possibly these things were in the contracts from the very beginning of the band, that they would have solo albums. Anyway, there's some question as to actually how this whole thing came about. But either way, they did this, and they shipped platinum. They were expecting these albums to sell and sell big. Now, they ended up not selling everything that they shipped. As a matter of fact, a lot of these albums ended up in what we kind of know as cutout bins, where they had to sell them at a discount because they couldn't sell them all. But when you look back at the numbers, for Kiss, they didn't sell super, super well, but by anybody else's measure, these albums sold like crazy. What ended up happening, and I know this happened for me, and I wonder if this is also what happened with you, is that instead of buying all 4 records, you would just buy one. You'd buy the one from your favorite guy. And part of the reason this became a problem was a lot of the fans of Kiss at that time were getting younger and younger and younger. And of course, they don't have the disposable income that older people would. And so these 4 albums come out, and you kind of get to this, you're thinking, well, I don't know, I can't have all of them. So what did I do? Well, I got the Paul Stanley solo album. As a matter of fact, the Paul Stanley solo album 8-track, that, I guess the following year, ended up in my Easter basket from the Easter Bunny. Don't ask me why. The Easter Bunny knew that I would want the Paul Stanley 8-track, but I ended up with that in my Easter basket. So getting back to this article, I think you're really going to enjoy listening to what they had to say in the Miami Herald. And before we read the article, if you would do me a favor right now and go down and click that subscribe button if you're not already subscribed to the channel, and also click the like button. Then here's the title of the article: Kiss Solo Discs, 4 Bags of Tricks. Now, one of the things, if you're a Kiss fan, you get used to is that people are always knocking Kiss. It's rarely just all rainbows and balloons when it comes to Kiss. They always find ways to cut them down. And this article is no different, but it's also pretty interesting. And like I said, I think you'll enjoy this. In mathematics, the whole is equal to the sum of its parts. But the newly released Kiss solo albums amount to a case of the parts being holed up to make a sum. That is, holed up in studios to make a sizable sum of money. Now, when you take into consideration, just as a side note here, how many albums they had been putting out over just the last couple of years, you start talking about making profits and how many albums they were selling, it is actually shocking. Because here they were, remember, they really released their first album in 1974. By 1975, they had put out 3 solo albums and a live album, which was Alive 1, which ended up being the thing that really put them on the map. So then after a live one is released, what do? They go back into the studio, they release Destroyer, they put out Rock and Roll Over, they put out Love Gun, and they put out another live album, all by 1977. So 4 more records there just in a couple of years. Not to mention the fact that they also put out another album somewhere in there that was called Double Platinum. I think that one came out in 1978. So then after they finished those things, they filmed a movie, Kiss Meets the Phantom of the Park. And then after that, they put out these 4 solo albums. And so these record company, the Casablanca, was just cranking out the records. And then, of course, they started doing all the merchandising that went along with it. And so when they make this point here, that this in some ways could almost be seen as just a way of doing another cash grab. We're just making money while we can. They're the biggest band in the world. Just start doing as much as we possibly can to take advantage of it. And that's kind of what it seemed like was going on back then. Okay, carrying on. The Kiss concept is rooted in promotion, merchandising, and gimmickry, but that doesn't cause these musicians to lose face. Heck, losing face is the essence of their gimmick. Their faces are painted. Their looks a deep, dark secret. No tricks are left unturned in the marketing of this malleable rock band. Marvel Comics recently inaugurated a whole line of picture books with the painted ones as stars. A Kiss television movie has been made. A full line of Kiss posters is being marketed. And it's interesting that they use that word malleable, because when you look back at the history of Kiss, not only were they malleable in all the different merchandising they would do, all the different products and things they were putting out there to make money, but they were also pretty malleable in their music. In other words, they weren't afraid to take some, what I think were kind of pretty wild risks in some of their song choices. I mean, when you look at Destroyer and the song Beth, which ended up becoming their, really probably one of their biggest hits, that was kind of out there. And as a matter of fact, they were wondering, can we do this? I remember reading Gene, I think it was in his book, he talked about this going, here was a song we were putting on this album that we literally didn't even play on. The only part of the band that was even in that record was just Peter's voice, or in the song was Peter's voice. And then Gene is thinking, well, the Beatles did that with Eleanor Rigby, so maybe we can do that too. But the point I'm making here is that they were actually really malleable in their music. I mean, look at the end of the side 4 of Alive 2, and they put that old song Any Way You Want It on there, which is kind of a strange song for them to do. Even on Love Gun, Then She Kissed Me. Anyway, these are just kind of, they were strange. They would do strange things with their music. They weren't afraid to take a few risks here and there. And then even on the solo albums, I mean, you look at Gene on his solo album, When You Wish Upon a Star. Anyway, so they were malleable. They were willing to take some risks here and there. Okay, anyway, moving on. The crass commercialism doesn't escape the solo albums themselves. Inside each, an ad announces the latest ways for teeny boppers to kiss off their money. Kiss keychains, Kiss necklaces, Kiss belt buckles, Kiss, well, you get the idea. And I'm curious, how many of you remember that, and how many of you ordered something? Because every time you'd get a Kiss album, you'd open that thing up, and of course, inside there was an order form, so you could send in and just get stuff, Kiss things, posters, belt buckles, you get the idea here. And I'm sure all of you remember this. Let's see here. As a further ploy to entice fans to buy the entire set of 4 records, interlocking posters are included in each album. By the way, do you remember getting the poster? I had the Paul Stanley album also, not just the 8-track, and I definitely had that poster up on my wall for a while. The posters fit together to form a giant Kiss mural. It's almost surprising that Casablanca, their label, remembered to include the albums. That's a great line. But the discs are there, though 3 of them could as well have been marketed as Kiss Frisbees. Basically, the 4 albums can be summed up as follows: the good, the bad, the mediocre, and the ugly. Now, a brief look at each in descending order. So now they give you their description of which one was good, bad, mediocre, and ugly. And I'm curious what you think about this when you hear this. And again, because we lost Ace recently, this kind of jumped out at me as something interesting as we remember Ace and his music and his life. So, number 1, Ace Frehley. Ace Frehley easily outclasses the members of his band with this solo project. expertly produced by Eddie Kramer, who has also produced for the likes of Jimi Hendrix and Led Zeppelin. Frehley comes across as the most competent musician of the group and also as a first-class songwriter. Handling all the guitar parts on the album, including most bass licks, Frehley also plays synthesizer, sings lead and backing vocals. The amount of work he handles alone, without the overabundance of session men used on the other solo discs, shows that the guitarist is indeed a capable performer. And this is a really interesting thing to think about. Because as we talked about in previous videos, one of the things that Gene and Paul had kind of envisioned when they made Kiss was to have it be a little bit like the Beatles. In other words, you had these four very distinct personalities and everybody would have their favorite one, just like everybody did with the Beatles. But they also wanted all four of them to sing. And up until near this point, Ace just wouldn't do it. He was very insecure about his voice. He didn't really like the idea of singing, and so he just wouldn't. But then finally on Love Gun, he sang one song that he wrote, and it was called Shock Me. And we have a whole nother video where we talk about that he'd been almost electrocuted, or he'd been electrocuted. And then anyway, we had this incredible song on the album Love Gun. And then here he sings for the first time. Then not long after that, they do these solo albums, and now he's singing the entire album. He went from not singing at all for several years to one song and now an entire album. And then when the next thing they released after this, which was the next studio album, which was Dynasty, he actually sang several songs on that album. So he just kind of expanded. And then, of course, when he left on his solo career later, he'd be singing all the time, all kinds of things. But just kind of an interesting trajectory there. So he was, and they recognize it here, a true musician in so many different ways, including now a singer. Fractured Mirror, an instrumental, showcases his talent as it starts off slowly, builds, then returns to its original melody. On Wiped Out, Frehley shows a sense of humor. The song starts out with a drum solo parodying the old 60s song, Wipeout. Other standouts on this disc are New York Groove and Speedin' Back to My Baby. Okay, that's their review of Aces. Now, that was the good, now the bad. Gene Simmons. Sometimes in music, more can be less. Take the case of Gene Simmons, please, and make sure his bass guitar is in it. While Frehley's album is sparsely produced, Simmons has overcompensated by having more things going on than a three-ring circus, with him playing the role of a clown. Simmons has assembled an all-star cast, but to no avail. The players include Bob Seger, Aerosmith, Joe Perry, Helen Reddy, Jeff "Skunk" Baxter, Donna Summer, Cher, and Janice Ian. Opting for a Phil Spector wall of sound type production, the disc ends up becoming a wall of noise. Now, it's interesting also to note that he did go after all of these really famous people, because that does kind of follow what Gene was doing at the time. Because even though he really wouldn't start pursuing being in movies until years later, early on, he was out in Hollywood and he was meeting people, and he just really liked being in that crowd. And so it's not surprising that he kind of brought this, all of these, more famous people in there to be on his record. There is a chorus of people singing on nearly every song, making lyrics almost incomprehensible. The album reaches a ludicrous low point when, with the complete lacking of the Los Angeles Philharmonic Orchestra, Simmons sings, or attempts to sing, When You Wish Upon a Star from Walt Disney's Pinocchio. Okay, now Paul Stanley. So this one's the mediocre one, according to them. By the way, I just have to put a note in here. I loved Paul Stanley's solo album because that was the one I had, and I listened to that thing over and over and over when I was a kid. I absolutely loved it. I still love those songs on there. The mediocre album of the four is Paul Stanley's. Admittedly, the disc does have its moments, but a few moments out of 40 just doesn't cut it. The first two songs, Tonight You Belong to Me, which, by the way, I love that song. I love that tune. I think it's so great. And Move On, which I also like, are surprisingly good. But after that, the album falls flat, becoming a collection of power chord after power chord that, if nothing else, becomes dull. The album degenerates on the second side with such songs as Hold Me, Touch Me, Think of Me When We're Apart, a syrupy song that sticks to the roof of Stanley's mouth. And I'll admit again, even as a little kid, I kind of liked that tune. I just did. The disc was produced by Kansas producer Jeff Glicksman. It has some excellent session men such as Meatloaf's bassist Steve Buslow and guitarist Bob Kulick and session drummer Carmine Appice. Peter Criss. Now this is the good, the bad, the mediocre, and the ugly. So this is the one, according to them, that's the ugly one. With Peter Criss's solo disc, producer Vinnie Poncia is faced with the problem a fashion photographer sometimes encounters, namely hiding his model's flaws while trying to exaggerate the strong points. This would be fine if there were any strong points, but there aren't. Criss is Kiss's drummer, and his voice has more cracks than the San Andreas Fault. His drumming isn't exactly faultless either. Now, by the way, I love Peter's voice. I mean, there's some of those early tunes that he sang, I thought he was great. He has that kind of Rod Stewart, Bryan Adams, kind of scratchy, I don't know. I always liked his voice. Anyway, that's neither here nor there, but they're being very critical of his voice here. What we have here is an album of songs sung by someone who can't sing. The writing itself isn't too bad. Criss did write the group's big hit, Beth, but when he opens his mouth, the result is often embarrassing. On the song Hooked on Rock and Roll, the verse is, "Mama told me long ago there ain't no future in rock and roll." And then it ends up the article with, "What can you expect from a kid who didn't listen to his mama?" Anyway, I thought you would enjoy that as we think about Ace Frehley. We're just losing him a couple days ago. Hey, if you're not following the channel already, please follow the channel. Like this video. Love to get your comments down below about the different records, which ones you had, which songs you liked, which was your favorite. If you listened to all these things, what was the one you liked the most? And with that, have yourself a fantastic day.